Yeah, I've
We're
got no
live.
idea.
All right,
What
we
is?
are live.
Good morning, everyone. It's V, the Guerrilla Economist, coming to you live this morning on another edition of Rogue Money Mornings with V, CJ. And we are joined by the man of the hour himself, London Paul. Paul, what's going on, buddy? How are you?
Yeah, good morning, V. How are you?
I'm doing good. It seems as if this morning, there's a lot of backpedaling going on. It seems. From this
Yeah, I
whole
don't.
war footing.
Yeah, as I said to CJ, I've kind of been covering this off with our podcast subscribers. So it's been we've done quite a lot of detail again today. So I don't really want to go too much into the detail because obviously that would be unfair to them. But yeah, yes, undoubtedly there is backtracking going on, and we kind of know the reasons why, because as we said before, the reality is
Continue to talk, Paul.
the,
I just have to. I have a delivery at my office, so just keep talking. I'm sorry.
oh, okay, no, don't worry, no apologies. I think the reality is that we have to look at this from a military perspective, and whilst people will say it's actually not the reality, but the reality is the US is at significantly disadvantage to the Russians militarily. So by all means, they can come and try to launch an attack on Syria. But the question as well is, what is it actually going to achieve? Nothing. Is it going to? They could bomb 70, 100, or whatever sites they want in Syria. It's not going to materially remove Assad from power. It's going to achieve nothing. And the Russians have said, well, if you quite rightly, if you attack Assad targets, then to all intents and purposes, you're attacking her, and we will respond in kind. They've said they'll shoot missiles out of the sky and they'll attack missiles that sites which launch them. So they've been very straightforward about this. Now, from the US's perspective, is they know they're onto a hiding to nothing if they do this, because ultimately they don't have the military technology that the Russians have. And I'll say one thing, because I didn't even put this in the podcast, but what I will say is the Russians have the capability to take control of US missiles and redirect them back to the target. Now, if they were to do that, what would that show to the world? Well, quite honestly, it would signal the US was a sitting duck. Does the US want to be seen on a world stage to be a sitting duck? No. Now, that doesn't mean that cool heads hopefully will prevail. It's still in the melting pot to some degree, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on, which is kind of shaping events and what's happening. But do I think World War III is going to happen? No, because so World War III is going to happen because the US decide to bomb Assad because they believe that seriously that he was responsible for a chemical weapon attack in Douma. I mean, there's absolutely zero logic to it. Does the US want to take the world to oblivion as a result of that? No. Does the US want to risk oblivion in the Middle East for themselves? No, I don't think so. I mean, but that doesn't mean, of course, that there isn't a risk of this, and who is ultimately pulling the strings in the US is debatable. We've seen Donald Trump's tweets, and today's was far more conciliatory. I'm not really that bothered in the sense of but I think I made a point on Twitter. I think it was grossly irresponsible to make a tweet that basically is almost threatening to declare war on Russia. It doesn't matter whether it's a reality or not. Statesmen just don't do that. He's opening himself up for ridicule on a world stage, and more importantly, it's damaging to his own credibility in the US in terms of the Congress and the Senate, because there's comments where people are coming out going, well, if Trump wants to go and launch an attack on Syria, then he needs congressional approval or whatever. So they could use it against him. And therefore, it's ill-advised to start doing this, whether it's just him puffing his chest out a bit, or people say it's 4D chess, which I completely disagree about, because there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's just not 4D chess to do this.
You mean it's really not?
It has
maybe it's 5D chess, Paul, and we just don't realize it.
I mean, one obvious point is we're not just talking about the Russians and the Syrians. We've got other nations. You've got the Israelis, the Iranians, and the Saudis. they may look at these tweets and go, hang on, we're going to respond to this. They may just do something completely irrational, completely impromptu, and therefore cause a major problem in the Middle East unnecessarily. So it's for me, it's completely irresponsible to tweet like that. Doesn't mean the reality of it is going to come to anything, but I just think, you just don't make those sort of comments. I mean, the Russians kind of took it tongue in cheek and didn't really pay that much attention to it, and made some comments about the fact that, they don't conduct diplomacy on Twitter. So that was a polite way of saying, this isn't how you conduct yourself. But yeah, undoubtedly, it's in the melting pot. There's a lot of developments going on. I don't suspect World War III is going to happen. I think there's a clear mandate to avoid that. I think it's just a question of, do the US take Russia seriously enough that they'll respond? And I think increasingly they are, because there's no doubt that the diplomatic channels and all the back channels, there's probably been endless discussions going on for the last couple of days just to calm the situation down. I think it's calmed down significantly, not entirely, but then it comes to the point of, well, okay, if it ends up not going to war and it's all, and everyone backs off, there has to be a kind of get out clause for everybody, and that's a whole development which I've discussed in the podcast as part of it, because the US, if it backs off, doesn't want to lose face, obviously. I know it sounds ridiculous. A nation should just hold their hand up and go, yeah, we made a mistake and these are why. But we all know that that's not how the world operates. But I think the problem is, and to take it into a broader context, what concerns me slightly is that things are getting framed where the idea is Trump's playing a great big game, and so are the Russians and so are the Chinese, and in the end it's a win-win for Trump. And it's like the trade war. People think it's a great game that Trump's playing, but the Chinese have come out today and said, we're not playing games. We haven't made concessions based on what Trump said. We're making concessions which has got nothing to do with Trump and this trade war. And China will press ahead, and for every dollar that the US decide to impose on the Chinese in trade tariffs, they'll reciprocate. But in the end, it's going to come a point where the US is going to lose far more than China does. And yet, there's a lot of belief that somehow, well, Trump's in the driving seat with this. No one's in the driving seat with a trade war. And it's like North Korea, as though, well, it was all down to Trump why this has come about. Well, it isn't. It's it's sort of not looking at it in a broader sense, and it concerns me slightly that not everybody, there are people who think Trump's in the driving seat with regards to what's going on in Syria, and somehow, he's whatever he's saying, oh, don't worry, because it's just part of this game. It isn't a game. The real risk is, and I'm not exaggerating, and I don't think for one minute it'll happen, but if you follow this through to its logical conclusion, and the US launched an attack, then Russia responds, and Russia responds in a way that directly engages the US. We know where this ultimately could all end up. So there's no games being played in, and Russia and China don't play games. They're very straightforward. They don't want they want all this tension to simmer down. They want an end to it. They want a recognition of the reality of who's responsible for whatever
Paul?
Attack happened in Syria.
Yeah, Paul, you want to know something? Something just hit me right now. What just hit me is this. What if this whole entire thing is not a rush to war? What if the chemical gas attack, which is proven to be true, there was no chemical gases released, there was no soil samples that tested positive for chlorine gas, there's no dead bodies, this was a staged event, a false flag created by the white helmets, or the white dunce camps, as I like to call them. What if none of that was the exact thing? What if this whole entire thing is to do one thing and one thing only, is to remove and entrap Trump and remove him from office? What if that is the motive? And when you look at the evidence, right, when you really take a step back and get a 36,000-foot view into this whole entire thing, it's pretty. I think the picture's becoming very, very clear, right? All of this.
I mean, it's entirely it's possible. The thing is, I think the timing of this, it's always about the timing. Now, there's no doubt there was an element of desperation to it, because they thwarted previous chemical weapon attacks that the Russian and Syrian intelligence had become aware of, and then obviously it was out of sheer desperation because they were getting to the point where Duma was going to be liberated, and East Ghouta was liberated, and therefore there was this press to go, right, well, let's just frame Assad and then give a pretext for going to war with Assad effectively, and because there's no other reason. Yeah, you could be right that there may be a possibility it was an attempt to drag Trump into, because what happens? I mean, let's just follow this trying to train of thought through. Imagine if Trump had just decided, okay, well, let's just go and launch a strike, and it happened, 24 hours ago. I think Congress and the Senate would have absolutely pilloried him. I think it could have been, the end of his presidency potentially.
Of course.
I don't think we can. Yeah, because they would have then used the argument, not like it didn't matter in the past that 12 months ago he was able to launch a strike on the Sharat base, and nobody, there was no problem then. But I think if he pushed the button, so to speak, not the button, but to launch an attack on Assad, and things had unfolded the way we fully expected to, they could have. Yeah, there's every realization that could have been used against him, and I think that's why we saw. I don't know who it was who made the comment. That in order to launch an attack, you need congressional approval. I think there was some element of reality that if he had pushed ahead, and I think ironically there was probably some people in the military who've actually diffused the situation sufficient to prevent a sort of knee-jerk reaction to something and said, well, hang on a minute. As much as all this has been said, we need to be absolutely clear that Assad is responsible. And it may have been couched in military terms that people inside the Pentagon are waking up to the reality that they're at a significant disadvantage militarily to the Russian. But it doesn't really matter in the end of the day. If it made people in the Trump administration take a step back, then all well good. I mean, ultimately, I have to question who's also pushing Trump's buttons, because it's like we said the other day, it sounds unbelievable, but there is no doubt if you were the president, you or I, well, I couldn't be, but for argument's sake, I was the president in the US, and I'm getting hammered with all these people telling me there's all this intelligence. Yes, Mr. President, don't worry, it absolutely confirms that Assad's responsible. Are you absolutely sure about this? Yeah. We have all the evidence, and and we can't tolerate this anymore. He's killing children. It's always back to the children and the women. That's
they care about kids so much. That's why.
Sorry?
They care about kids so much. That's why.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's that emotive language. And if you're sat there and imagine, it's fine for us to discuss this when we don't have that level of responsibility. But you're thinking, well, I've got that to consider. I've got to consider, what the American people are thinking about this. The pressure cooker, the lid starts to blow off, and you can quite easily, and undoubtedly, everyone sees all presidents as being malign, and I'm not saying all presidents are, whiter than white, but there are occasions when undoubtedly they're thrown some bait and they grab onto it, and they're convinced that that something has happened, and is absolutely categorically the case, and therefore they then act accordingly. And there is no doubt that there was moves, I suspect, to really reinforce to Trump, that in the initial stages, Assad's completely responsible, and then I think cooler heads probably inside the military, maybe some people inside the Trump administration sat him down and went, well, hang on a minute. Let's just look at the simple logic. Why would Assad, who was clearly in the ascendancy, the war's all but over, why is he suddenly, when you've announced, Mr. President, that you're going to leave Syria, decides to go just for absolutely no reason, launch a chemical attack and kill his own people, knowing full well the first thing we're going to do is threaten to bomb him and absolutely not leave Syria. So. And it sounds ridiculous that perhaps, Trump hadn't thought of this. I'm not saying he did or he didn't, but in the heat of the moment and the pressure that's being applied, it's probably, we can all sit here and be very kind of somber and how we would approach it. But if we were in his position, it's probably not quite that simple. And undoubtedly, I think there is a high risk that that's precisely what's happened. But as the days go by and more intelligence comes out, and there's more and more back channel conversations between the Russians and the Americans and maybe other parties in the process, it starts to sort of moderate the viewpoint. And of course, gradually we'll see what happens in the coming days as to precisely how this unfolds, because there is a whole bunch of other stuff going on and interesting developments which kind of shape this in different ways than what we're discussing. But obviously, as I said, I don't want to discuss that because obviously that would be unfair to subscribers. But I think we are at a position where there's certainly an element where it is kind of less, maybe we kind of moved a few notches down in the DEFCON stakes. I mean, but I don't ever believe that World War III was ever a possibility, because when push comes to pull, even the Kabbalists, as insane as they are, and as much as they have a bloodlust, they're not. All this idea, well, they can all rush to their bunkers and sit it out. Well, how long? If you have complete sort of mutual obliteration of the planet, how long are they going to sit in these bunkers for before they can even come out? And how are they going to exist on a planet that's being completely reduced to rubble? It's just, there's no reality to it. They want control, and they want to use military force when people don't acquiesce to them. But the idea that they'll go for complete obliteration is just simply not the case, because obliteration obliterates them.
Mm-hmm.
What are they going to do? They're going to have an empire of dust.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
Absolutely not. So no, I just don't think that there's a reality. But I made the point a few weeks ago, and I said the thing is, back channels are hugely significant, because it's the one reason why we all go to bed at night, whatever part of the world we're in, and we wake up in the morning and everything's pretty much the same. It's because of this, because there are constant threats, there are constant risks. And I'm not the kind of risks that the media try to portray just to terrify us into believing things. Just genuine risks, genuine problems. I mean, and a totally separate aside, it's like everybody's got nuclear arsenals, but they're hugely risky in the fact that particularly I think in the Western world, I don't know with respect to what happens in Russia, whatever, but nuclear arsenals cost billions a year to maintain. They're very fragile, they're very delicate. Now, there's always the risk that you could have an internal problem that causes a missile to be detonated, because of the age of them, because of the maintenance, because it is very delicate and fragile. There are problems. Just because you've both got nuclear arsenals, you have to keep people informed so you're fully aware of what's going on, what the situation is. Otherwise, the risk is something could happen that starts an obliteration process of the planet, and that's the last thing any side wants, be it the Russians or Americans. Yeah, there are some fundamental problems currently, but the fundamental problems between the Russians and the Americans and the Syrians has got nothing to do with most people. It's just to do with the Kabbalists, who want to set out because they want the energy pipelines put in. They want control of the Middle East, because then they can strip all the assets and strip all the resources. That's all it is. That's all they're interested in, is assets, resources, and ensuring they control them all, because when they control them all, that gives them power. It's not about money. Everyone thinks, oh, they just want all. No, money's not. When they had trillions of dollars, what's money? Money's irrelevant.
They don't need them. They print it.
No. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The money's irrelevant. It's the power in controlling assets and controlling country. And when you don't have the capability to control Syria, and given its strategic position, and obviously now the rebirth of Iran and how the Middle East reshaping, the Kabbalists have lost control of it. They've lost control of Qatar. They tried to economically blockade them because they're obviously starting to rotate towards Russia and Iran, etc. Iran's now we're seeing the rebirth of Persia. Syria, we're seeing the rebirth of that. I mean, okay, it's still notionally the civil war going on, but it's reaching the latter stage. And country after country is kind of starting to moderate and reform, and the Middle East's changing shape. That's not what was part of the plan. So that's all it is. It's about domination. I mean, that's why they subjugated and destroyed the whole of Africa. because they didn't want the Africans being able to develop their own assets, because it's a very asset-rich continent. Of course, in the future, that will change, and Africa will become a very strong, vibrant continent, but it's going to take quite a few years. It may take decades. I don't know. We don't know, but that's part of the process. It's just controlling everything, because when they control everything, then no one else is able to challenge them. But it's not about money. Money's is totally irrelevant, and that's why, as you say, by having the dollar was great, because it was just, it was a never-ending credit card that just keeps paying out for them. But of course, that's all changing in the process as well, without us needing to go into that in any detail.
So we hear that Theresa the drunk May is all of a sudden she has a spite of liquid courage and is threatening to move some UK submarines right next to Syria. And now this morning, it's we got even Macron saying maybe we need to reevaluate the so-called evidence that we have. It's amazing how this thing quickly falls apart, and I think it was pivotal, Paul, that the Russians. It was a good thing the Russians were able to go to Duma, secure the crime scene, and interview the people, get the soil samples in, and get those investigators in, those international investigators that went there and looked, and hey, there's really nothing here. I think that was a major turning point in this whole entire thing. And to do it so quickly was a godsend.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Russian. Well, it's like anything. The Russians and the Syrians are very coordinated in the Middle East in every aspect of what they do, and militarily, the coordination center actually is in Moscow for all operations.
Wow.
And the idea that the Russians, from the day they set foot back in there in 2015 and said enough's enough, that that was the beginning of the huge turning point in terms of Syria. And I mean, it staggers me, because the last few days I've gone out my way to read online publications I wouldn't normally bother with, mainstream, so because I just want to gauge what the feeling is, what the sentiment is, and the kind of people with Twitter accounts, and kind of how people respond. And it's incredible to read where the average person who trusts and believes in their government, like be it the UK or the US, whatever, and someone comes in and just throws this proverbial hand grenade of common sense and logic and intelligence and understanding, and their attitude is, well, how could you possibly know anything about this? You can't know more than what my government knows. You can't know more than what the intelligence services are telling us. And that's the problem. They just genuinely believe every aspect of what they're told, and they don't question anything, because they can't conceive that they live in these wonderful democracies. They just cannot believe for 1 minute that their government would lie to them, even though we all know that with the Iraq war and the removal of Saddam and the weapons of mass destruction, everybody knows it was a lie. And yet they never think back and go, hang on, we were lied to then. Is there even a remote possibility we're being lied to again? But I am actually starting to see, from what I understand, that there's a bit more sort of, in the mainstream press, a bit more sort of questioning as to what's going on, and people are starting to say, hang on, certain things don't seem to stack up. But I think the one thing that made a big difference in the UK was the whole thing with the Skripals, because that started to make people think differently. Because and it's interesting, we can talk about the OPCW came out. Well, they've come out with a report. We don't know the details of the report because the report's confidential, but there was a summary that was produced. And yet that in itself for me was quite interesting, because there's a 12-point summary, and effectively they talked about how they brought these teams to the UK, and then they obviously received all the medical information, and it wasn't just the Skripals, it was also the police officer Nicholas Bailey, who was, we found the Skripals on a park bench, as far as I can recall. And then they did all these blood tests, and then they cross-referenced it with materials that they said were recovered from the site, and then they did all this kind of chemical analysis. And yet, what was interesting is they said that and this was the exact words they used. They said the results of the analysis by the OPCW designated laboratories of environmental and biomedical samples collected by the OPCW team confirmed the findings of the UK relating to the identity of the toxic chemical that was used in Salisbury and severely injured 3 people. And it says this team noted that the toxic chemical was of high purity. But this is the interesting part. They actually admitted they couldn't ascertain where the chemical, this nerve agent or toxic chemical came from. But here's the bit that I found interesting is when they said the name and structure of the identified toxic chemical are contained in the full classified report of the Secretariat available to states parties. So nowhere in this summary did they mention Novichok. And I'm not saying, well, they're not saying it wasn't Novichok, but they're not saying it was. Let's be clear about that. The other thing is, nowhere in this summary does it mention Russia once. Now, that might just be a mere coincidence. There's no mention of Russia, but there was no mention of Russia either. And the question I would like to know is, why is the name and structure of the identified toxic chemical in the full classified report of the Secretariat? Now, the only interesting part is that all the nations that are under the Chemical Weapons Convention that was signed in 1997 will receive a copy of that. Now, what's interesting is there's 4 nations who aren't signed up to that properly. Israel signed up to it but didn't ratify the treaty. And then Egypt, North Korea, and South Sudan have neither signed nor ratified it. So what it would suggest is that this confidential report will be received by the Russians, Chinese, and everyone else. So you would expect that the Russians might decide to say, well, hang on, here's the detailed information. And here's actually we'll identify the toxic chemical used. And I just asked the question, why in this summary didn't it mention? Why did it not actually say, instead of making the point and saying, well, we've confirmed the findings of the UK relating to the identity of the toxic chemical? Why didn't they just say identify of the toxic chemical Novichok? This is what's puzzling. It doesn't mean it wasn't. It doesn't mean they didn't do that. But why not mention it? Why? And then, of course, back to the point, they can't identify the source of it. So I think in a way, the government will jump on this and say, well, it confirms everything we've found. Well, maybe the Russians and the Chinese will, release the name and the structure of what they're saying this toxic chemical is. But I think what this proves is that people are beginning to question things. It's like the fact that Yulia Skripal is being taken to some secure unit, and then there was a statement released by I think the London Metropolitan Police that the Russians have said, well, hang on, we're not sure that she even wrote this. And the question is, why isn't she allowed to just come and talk publicly about it? 1 minute they're saying, oh, Sergei Skripal's nearly fully well, and or not fully well, but getting a lot better and might be discharged from hospital. And then the statement she released said he was still seriously ill. There's all these kind of contradictions. But what this has all done is made people start to question what's being said to them, and the fact that comments were made and attributed to Porton Down, and then they weren't. Then Porton Down said, well, actually, we didn't. Well, they didn't say we didn't say it, but they said, we don't know the source of this Novichok. But I think it just demonstrates the fact that the narrative with regards to the Skripals and Novichok is falling apart in the UK, and the narrative in Syria with respect to, they're saying it was chlorine gas, and in Douma and it was a set, is beginning to fall apart. And I think part of it is because there's a lot more critical discussion and critical thinking that's going on, or ironically in social media, that was probably never created for the purpose of for us to disseminate information, to discuss it. But I'm encouraged by the fact there are increasingly large numbers of people. I mean, let's forget people sort of from Russia and the East, but in the West, there's more and more people who are starting to look at this and go, hang on, I'm not buying the official narrative. There's people I know who have known on Twitter who I've started to see, and I've known them through because I do have my own personal account, which obviously we have the separate one, but I've known them for years, and they're starting to kind of have a very different perspective on what's unfolding, and that is highly encouraging, because it's that more than anything that's going to change the sort of narrative, and how the governments in the future are going to start going, we can't, well, maybe forget even governments, just we can't get away with this anymore. We can't just blindly, make statements and people in nations sort of follow it. If you'd gone back 10 or 15 years ago and said, well, Assad's responsible, we wouldn't have had the kind of discourse that's going. We wouldn't have had people like Craig Murray in the UK discussing the Scribbles and putting some very intelligent debate out there, and really making people think about what's happening. So in that respect, as much as we malign Facebook and malign Twitter to some extent, and malign Google, all these things, and ultimately Facebook, etc., I think will be broken up. I don't think it will exist the way it does now. I think we're going to see a huge seismic change in social media for the better in the future. That's beside the point. It has been, in a way, been a useful conduit to disseminate information, to get people to discussing, and wake more and more people up to the reality of what's going on. And it's frankly no news to me that or maybe Facebook's had all this information, and maybe some of your information ended up going to other parties, whatever, blah blah blah. None of this is a surprise. I mean, for me, I didn't care the fact that Facebook may or may not have had information. It's of no relevance or concern to me, because it's no surprise. It's a bit like the whole Snowden revelation. The only thing that I found surprising is that anyone was surprised what he said. There was no surprise in terms of in what he actually said. But it's not really about what you and I understand. The surprise factor was how it sort of woke a lot of people up and made them see things differently, and people saw the NSA differently and started to go, hang on, maybe all my data is being harvested and sold on to people, or maybe it is, but it's a waking up process, and but in the long term, I don't see a big future for any of the current social media platforms. I think we'll see a big sort of change, and it will become a far better platform for people to use, and it will evolve in ways that's far beyond my. I mean, I'm not sort of technically orientated that way. I'm not particularly very creative in terms of knowing what it will be, because it's not something. I'm just good at using things, for not implementing it. But there's certainly a big move to bring out new platforms. And you've covered it off with things like Steemit and things like that. There's all these new platforms, and it will evolve and change rapidly in the future, because when the world does change, information dissemination is going to be, well, it's better the world. Everybody knows this, not this idea that knowledge is power anymore. It's going to be the reverse, because that's what's going to progress and make the world evolve a lot quicker and in a far better way, when information is shared and people are able also to express views and express opinions, and not be stamped down in the process, which you and I have had personal experience. I mean, for YouTube, it was incredible. We put up a clip, and we monetized it, and in 15 minutes it was demonetized. I think 2 people had read it. And ever since, and now we can't even monetize anything on it because we don't have enough views. That's it. There's a new criteria. If you don't have sufficient views, you can't monetize any of your content.
Jeez.
But anyway, it's kind of, it is what it is. It's a transient thing, and it doesn't really matter. But yeah, I to be honest, I didn't really follow the whole Zuckerberg thing. Someone asked me about it, and I wasn't really that.
Yeah. Nothing to follow there. I mean, first of all, he wasn't under oath. Second of all, most of those politicians that were grilling him were receiving campaign contributions from Facebook to begin with. It was just a sideshow. That's all it was.
Yeah, and really, it doesn't matter, because the future is from my perspective, where do it's not for me to say because I don't know, but where do we realistically see current social media platforms in the next 2 years or 3 years? And I think we'll see a huge revolution. Certainly, the Russians have their own internet platform which they could roll out, and I'm sure in the West we're going to see. I mean, that's the thing. We do have some technologically great people, and if you actually put them in a room together and they work together, they can come up with some fantastic solutions. And that's the difference. We've got to take all these underground people, for want of a better word, who've devised all this technology and say, okay, we can get this rolled out and make it sort of more universally accessible. And it's like anything; it's part of that process of stimulating growth. And I don't doubt it's like any nation, be it the UK or the US or anywhere else. There's a lot of great people, and if you get these great people in the right room together and they're able to develop ideas, it will technologically revolutionize the Western world as well. And in the process, it will employ a lot of people, and it be something of substance as well. And that's the big difference. I think most currently, with all due respect, Facebook is of note. What substance does it have? I mean,
None.
And increasingly, it seems as though, what was it? Someone said to me, was saying to me, it's like someone's. I think it was their daughter said to them, "Oh, Dad, why are you using Facebook? That's for grandparents." I mean, there's all these other platforms. You should be using those. So it is part of that evolutionary process, and really grilling to whatever extent Zuckerberg at this stage, it's like the horse is long since bolted. So what's the point in shutting the stable door? It's just it has no relevance really.
Exactly. What's your outlook for the next in terms of closing statements? What's the outlook for the next next few days, man, next few weeks? Do we want to see cooling down, or?
Well, I guess we just have to kind of see what happens with respect to Syria, and you would hope cool heads will prevail. I think logically in the US military there is a lot of cool heads. I think the last few, since 9/11, basically, there's an awful lot of people probably in the US military who said, we're just sick of war and pointless war. I mean, it's not like there was any legitimate reason to go to war in Iraq or Afghanistan or any of these incursions into Libya or Syria or anywhere else. All it's done is cost, I don't know how many lives, countless lives of being lost for absolutely no reason. In the process, that it's wasted trillions of dollars, which imagine if the US had actually spent the trillions of dollars to benefit the country instead of going around the world just blowing things up, having this extended military presence all around the world, which is absolutely of no use or benefit to the Americans whatsoever. It's that kind of rethinking, and I think there probably are people in the military who've gone, we're just sick. We're sick of war. What war achieves absolutely nothing. I mean, everyone knows ultimately what wars are being fought for. It's not for freedom. It's just to enrich the cabal and move the chess pieces around the board and allow them to control more and more and consolidate more and more power. That's the whole purpose of any war.
Right.
I mean, because here's the point: if they were actually genuinely concerned about humanity, there's hellholes on this planet that they've done nothing. We've had humanitarian crisis caused by insane governments, and they've sat there and done absolutely nothing. So they have no interest in humanity, as we know.
Yeah.
But I think that hopefully that's a stabilizing influence inside the US. I mean, I don't know how the hierarchy works in terms of from military perspective, as equally as I don't really know how it works in the UK. I mean, yes, you have all these defense departments, and you've got the Pentagon and all this, and the UK have sort of corresponding organizations, but ultimately how the decision-making process is, I don't know how that truly operates. Perhaps someone out there or yourself know how that works, but I think cooler heads hopefully will prevail, because if they don't, the alternative really doesn't worth thinking about, because I just don't think even the US now are starting to go, the Russians are not just going to back off and go, okay, just bomb as many targets as you want in Syria and we'll just all walk away and pretend it never happened. Those days have gone. I mean, and that's the other big fundamental change is the days. I mean, what changed? As much as we talk about defining moments, one point that changed the Russians' perspective about everything was Libya.
Yeah,
because they got completely duped in Libya, and they went, "Hang on, you didn't do anything you said you were going to do. All you did is went in, removed Gaddafi,
well, you had
caused an
Medvedev
absolute
in power at that time. The Russian liberals who just trusted their Western partners, quote unquote, and that blew back in their face real quickly.
Yeah, and and since then they've never trusted them.
Yeah.
And of course, then when we had all the events unfolding in Syria, that was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But yeah, we just have to watch how events unfold. I think things are moving in a downward trajectory in terms of the risk, but it might be just one of those things that it's just going to gradually fizzle out over a period of time, and it's like, oh well, actually, it never really happened, and they'll kind of go and do some investigations independently in Duma, and then the results will come out, and it'll be like this 2 inches of column inches somewhere, and we'll just kind of walk away and pretend none of this ever happened because it's so highly embarrassing. But
right, exactly.
But for me, it's a watershed moment. It's the last hurrah for the cabal to try and do anything, and the ultimate question is, who wants to see the planet obliterated?
No, nobody. It's a lose-lose proposition at the end of the day. It's a lose-lose proposition.
Yeah,
Paul,
thank
you so much, my man, for being on with us and spending your
time.
Oh no,
it's a pleasure. If time permits and whatever, then yeah, we can do this. I mean, Absolutely. it's good in some ways to have no kind of idea what we're going to discuss and see where the conversation takes us, because often it stimulates kind of interesting debate as to and takes us off at tangents. So it's always a good thing to do that, and hopefully it stimulates people to think differently, and also please we all say get in touch, and if you people have questions or things they'd like to discuss or they'd like us to talk about, as long as it's something we can talk about, then do so, because it's good to get people's input. Unfortunately, I think we don't get, well, I know we get a reasonable amount of input, but it'd be good to get more and for people to say what they'd like to discuss.
Exactly. Thank you, sir, for being on. And folks, thank you all for listening. Subscribe, like, and share. And again, check out Paul's theseriousreport.com. Check out the website, join the membership list, and join the ranks of those who are enjoying the service that Paul provides. With that being said, we're over and out. Take it away, CJ.